Okay, so the title of this differs. I got sloppy on that. But basically, the focus is on two-stage exams, which is actually using an exam as a learning tool. My experience had often been that I'd give an exam and then students would walk out of that exam and some of them would be happy, some of them would be less happy. And then the next class generally, or maybe two classes later, depending on how complex it was and how long it took me to grade them, I'd give them back and we'd go over it. And, there wasn't quite as much engagement with the exam after the fact as I would have hoped. Some students who did well would be generally okay with it, but they wouldn't pay all that much attention to it. I might ask people for some questions or ask them to explain their answers or something similar, but the students who didn't do as well generally didn't really engage with the exam very much afterwards. So a two-stage exam is a technique that a number of people are using. Paul Wyman's website has quite a bit of information about it. I first heard about it actually from Doug McKee in a podcast we did with him a few years back. Doug McKee is an economist down at Cornell, and he does a lot of research in economic education and education in general. He also is a host of the Teach Better podcast, although they've been slacking off a little bit because they've been really actively engaged in an active learning initiative at Cornell. And this is one of the tools that they've been encouraging. And the way a two-stage exam works, well, it involves peer instruction in ways of taking the exam and having students explain things to each other and work on them together. Peer instruction, I've mentioned this in other workshops. I'll just mention some of it briefly now. Eric Mazur talked about this, and I think most of you have probably heard me mention his discussion of that. One of the problems when we try to explain things to students is that we're explaining it given our level of understanding, and that often is at a higher level of understanding, generally is at a higher level of understanding than our students. We have this curse of knowledge where when we understand something really well, things become really obvious to us in terms of what tools and techniques to apply, what models apply from our discipline. And it's much harder for us to fully recognize all the problems that students have. I mean, you gain experience with that by working with students and talking to students and letting them explain to you what they understand and not. But students who have just recently discovered or come up with their own explanations of things at a similar level of cognitive development are often able to explain things better to other students than we can. And for the students who do understand things really well, they learn things much better when they teach it, when they explain it to other people. The act of explaining something to other people who don't understand it is a really tremendous way, I think, as we've all discovered at some point, of deepening our own understanding. So there's a lot of benefits with that. And when you go through the act of explaining concepts, it increases your ability to engage in transfer, to apply things in new formats, partly because you're trying to take the same concepts and explain them in other ways to students who might not always understand things in quite the same way. And that gives you more practice, and it seems to increase transferability based on a few studies at least. Now, the two-stage exam, which is what I wanted to focus on here, the most common method is you give the exam to students individually in the first stage, and then you give them a second stage in which they take the exam as a group. Now, at that second stage, it could be identical questions if you'd like to do that, or it could be questions that are equivalent but different, so that they're not able to go outside and just learn from it or use some source like Chegg to get answers or something similar. Or it could be a subset of the questions. What I first thought I'd do when I did this is I'd give all the students the exam, and the next class meeting, I had graded it. And for the next class meeting, I had decided I'd only give them the questions that they hadn't done that well on. And then I discovered that there were pretty much all the questions that at least quite a few students or a number of students hadn't done that well on. So basically, I let them take the exam again as a group. But it goes much more quickly when it's a second time and when they're working together on it. So in the second stage, groups of 3 to 4 students submit a group response, either for a subset of the questions, which could be the whole exam itself, So, if everyone gets something correct or nearly everyone, you don't have to include that in that stage. And they, as I said before, they could be equivalent, but not identical questions. Now, if you have enough time in your class session, you could do this all at once. You could have, if you're meeting a class, say for an hour and 20 minutes, or if it's a short exam, you could have them spend maybe 2/3 of the time or 3/4 of the time even taking the exam individually, turn that in, and then doing it as a group exam. Okay, where they all work together and they can bring in their own knowledge, argue things, debate things, and explain it to each other. And that new score is always greater. It's an approach that's very similar with team-based learning when they use those little scratch-off cards and so forth, where individuals answer the questions themselves, then they work as a group and they submit a group response. And it could be open book. Many people do it this way. I know Michelle Miller has been doing it this way for a while, and actually for the past year or so, and she's been using an open book approach in the second stage, where students take the exam individually, and then in the next stage, they work together and they also can look up things. And then you determine the overall grade for the exam as a weighted average of the individual and the group grades. And what I found with this approach is that, unlike those days when I would come back and give the exam, when I give the exam back and we go over it, where some students were happy but not paying that much attention, and some students were not so happy and not paying that much attention, all of the students were actively engaged in discussion. I was so excited with it, actually, the first time I did it, I took a picture of that or a short video clip of it and shared it with Rebecca because we had talked about this before I did it. And the students were actively discussing things and they were laughing. And, I'd hear the discussion saying, when did we learn that? And someone else would say, well, it was actually about 2 weeks ago when we were discussing this topic. And a lot of those issues where people said, I don't remember any of this, were resolved by having other students say, well, remember when we were talking about this application where we solved this type of problem? It's the same problem, or it's an equivalent problem. And they all ended up becoming much more comfortable with it, that the material was fresh. Again, this was generally the next class day. If I gave the original exam on a Monday, the second stage was done on a Wednesday. My class was only 50 minutes, so I couldn't do it all in one class period. But basically, I graded them. I gave them back the same exam to take as a group. And then when they turned in the group exam, I gave them all back their individual exams on the first part, graded. Then I graded the second part later that day. And then I posted the overall grade, which in my case, what I did was I used 2/3 of the grade was based on the original score, and 1/3 was based on the group grade. And that also made people feel a little bit better that as a result of the group processing, they were able to raise their scores a little bit. I did have one student whose scores went down, and at first I did use a weighted average approach on that. He started off with like a 98, and then the revised one was about a 90, or the group grade. And I said, well, I don't want to penalize him. But what I told him first is, you knew the answer to this. If you shouldn't have let the group convince you that your answer was wrong. If you're comfortable with something, if you really understand something well, be assertive and make the case and explain it to other people. That's going to help you by doing that. And it's also going to help the group by doing that. That only happened one time. I only gave 3 exams in this. They have a lot of other graded work. They were using clicker quizzes every day. They were working on projects. They had homeworks and they had a project, but it made the exam so much more positive as a learning experience. So I did it in 2018 and 2019. I also did it in 2020. As I've already described that. In 2020, we had shut, the first exam was done this way, but then the second exam was after we went remote. And so what happened in the second stage was I created 7 versions. I think students had about 6 or 7 questions. I created about 7 or 8 versions of each of the questions that were all isomorphic. They were all very similar types of problems, but with different parameters or different values. Because the first stage of the exam I gave was online over a 48-hour window. And I suppose, and the second stage was done using breakout rooms and screen sharing, where they worked on it as a group. where they were all in the breakout rooms. One of the people in each group shared their screen. They worked through it. They wrote up a solution, but it was still done in Blackboard. I just added one additional question for the Blackboard version of the test, asking them to list all the names of the participants in the group. And this worked reasonably well, except for the fact that I ended up having about 6 or 7 students who submitted the questions to Chegg. And in fact, most variants and most of the questions ended up being submitted to Chegg. And I had some really serious issues with academic integrity. In fact, the first submissions of this ended up being submitted within about 30 seconds of the test being open in Blackboard during that 48-hour window. And there were only really, I think, 2 or 3 people who submitted the questions, and the answers came back, and they clearly were not the work of a student here, partly because they were using mathematical techniques that were beyond those that are offered in most of our math classes. They were using terminology that was quite different. And they also, in some cases, were just blatantly wrong. They were responded to by someone who really didn't know anything at all about statistical analysis or econometrics. So it was pretty easy to detect that as being wrong. And I found all those cases, reported them, and a number of students ended up failing the class, which was a really disappointing experience. But for the students who didn't do that, for the other 22, 23 students in the class, it worked reasonably well. But it was certainly a bit of a problem. So this is how I determined the grade. Just set it up in the Blackboard gradebook where there was a category for each exam. So each exam 1, 2, and 3, which the last one was more essentially a cumulative final, they were all equally weighted. And it just basically defined the category grade as a weighted average of the 2 elements in there. So, and then the overall grade in the class just used the categories in the grade book. So essentially, there was a test 1 score, which was a weighted average of part 1 and part 2, test 2 score, which was a weighted average, test 3 score, which was a weighted average. And then, those values were used in the computation of the overall grade, for a column, which was a weighted average of these weighted averages, as well as all the other components of the class. It was pretty easy to do. And in terms of selecting the groups, students, and I've mentioned this in other sessions, some of you heard this earlier in a different context. What I did to try to make the groups balanced is I used a simple Google form, either in person or when we were meant, in each case, whether we were in person or whether we were meeting synchronously, as happened in 2021. And in that form, I just asked students how many prior math or statistics courses they had. And I sorted that from highest to lowest. And then I just went down, and if we had, let's say 11 groups, I would just assign the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and cycle through that. So each of the groups would end up with someone who has more courses in math and statistics, and would have someone who had very few classes in math and statistics, and typically 1 or 2 people somewhere in the middle. And students wanted to form the groups by forming groups with their friends because they've taken other courses with them. And as in other classes, what I did is I said, when they approached me with that, I said, well, think about why you know these people. You know them because, I said, well, how do you know these people? And they said, well, we've taken a lot of courses together. And I said, so if we form groups where some of the people have taken more classes together, often other math and statistics courses, everyone in that group would have a really strong background. And then the people who would be left over, who don't know as many people, are the people who've taken fewer math and stat classes. And would that really be a very fair way of balancing the groups? And they agreed. And so that was how the groups were done. And I did mention that case of a lower grade. And I did initially say I was going to use a weighted average, but it only happened once in those 3 years when I did this, and only on one of the exams. I think people got better about being more assertive when they really were sure they had the right answer. Okay. Well, so that's the two-stage exam. I also was going to mention in this other session, which was a bit longer, I also talked about exam wrappers, but let's skip and just focus on the on this. What questions do you have or thoughts? I'm going to start the sharing. I should say, I haven't mentioned 2021, and that's because after the experience I had with academic integrity violations in there, and having to fail, even one of my advisees that I'd been working with since their freshman year, I just decided not to have any high stakes exams. So I moved entirely to weekly quizzes. I added more variations on every question that they were asked to do. I used more algorithmic questions, and I also set time limits on the exam, making it harder. And I also set it up so that they could only do one question at a time with no backtracking, which made it really hard for them to submit questions to Chegg and get responses. And I didn't have any problems with that, partly because it was lower stakes, partly because I also put it in the syllabus that if any of them engage in any academic integrity violations involving submitting things to online sources or using online sources, they would fail the course. It just didn't happen in that class again. So, in a face-to-face exam, that was not a problem at all. But it was a pretty major issue when we went remote in March of 2020. So, questions, thoughts?
I'm trying to switch, in essence. I like the active component of it, them coming as a group. What I started to do this a couple years ago, is I give the exam back to them for corrections. And then the corrections follow the typical pattern. Good students do revise them, and they do provide meaningful corrections. And then students who do poorly on them, they just reiterate the question, hoping that I'm not going to look at them and they're going to get by. So I went back and I took the points that I gave back for corrections. I usually attach them to the grade on the exam, basically saying, okay, you need to turn in the corrections to keep the points. But I like this idea, in essence, of them doing it as a group. So perhaps what I'm going to try and doing is set up some correction sessions where I pair them in groups, and then have them do that together. I'm going to try to figure out the logistics in terms of splitting them in group, making sure about the policies. What happens if, the next day when we do this, not all of them are in class or present. But I like the idea. I really do.
Well, what I told them in terms of making sure first of all, in econometrics, they tend to attend every class. But
right.
What I told them is, if they don't submit a second grade, then the second grade would be 0, and they probably didn't want that averaged in. And that this was before the pandemic as well. And,
right.
It was a small class, only 30, 31, 32 students relatively. But I used to do the same thing in some classes, letting students submit revisions, and my experience was exactly the same. The students who got a 92 would try to make sure they got 100, while the students who got a 30 or 40 would turn in either very few or no revisions, or they disappear. The advantage of the second stage with a peer discussion is there's so much learning gains documented from peer instruction. I've seen that myself when I've used clicker questions where they work to explain it to each other, that I thought this was a really effective way of building this into an exam structure and actually having students learn, not just while they're taking the exam, but while it's fresh in their minds, while they've committed to an answer, getting that feedback and getting the feedback from peers is a really, really effective way of increasing learning. And I did see other than that academic integrity problem I ran into, I did see students coming back into class with a much deeper knowledge moving forward, that it wasn't that they made a mistake and that mistake was locked in. They actually learned from that second stage. And you don't have to make it a very large share. Michelle Miller notes that when she does it, she only gives 10% of the grade, I think it was, for the correction part. So, and generally, most people tend to use between 2/3 and 3/4 on the original work. Now, there was a question, there was a direct message that came in asking about, have you done it with 2 separate grades or always as one combined grade? It turns out it doesn't matter. If you don't want to create just the one average grade, the one combined grade, you could just assign weights that would be equivalent. So if you're using a weighted average of the exams, in the computation of the grade, you could just assign a weight that is a bit higher on that. How to implement it with a student that's taking the exam in the accessibility office? That's a really good question. That these 3 semesters, that was not an issue, but you would have to do something. You would have to do something to provide an equivalent experience. Do you have a suggestion on that, Paul?
I'll jump in really quick. If the first stage is done at the accessibility center, and then the work with the peers in class, that shouldn't be
That's a good
big
point,
deal.
because there's only one exam submitted from the group. So as long as it's not the student who is doing it, as long as the student who has accessibility requirements is not the one actually submitting it, that would probably work. And yeah, having a, Paul suggested in chat that they could use an open book second stage. That would be another way of doing it. Or if they were comfortable with it, having them work with a group where they could participate in the group discussions, that would probably, as long as that was acceptable to them, I think that would be a good workaround. I think I like your suggestion, Mihai. And Paul's suggestion too of an open book second stage could work too. Although that might be seen as an equity issue because the other students didn't have the same open book options. So going back to that other question about having each grade enter, if you want to just weight the individual contributions higher, you could just either assign fewer points to the second stage, or you could just, or you could use a weighted average where you just assign a lower weight in the overall grade computation to the second stage than to the individual score. So mathematically, those are perfectly equivalent. But I like the fact that students could see, so while they could see all the grades, but in the computation of the grades, they could see that their overall score for the exam went up in effectively all cases, or stayed the same in that one case after I adjusted it as a result of doing it as a group process. But there's a lot to be gained by having the students who understand some questions really well explaining it to other students. And you could see the light bulbs turn on, and people, a common thing was, oh yeah, now I remember that. Or someone would say, well, remember we did a homework problem in which we had to use log transformations, or in which we had to look at, in which we had to use these, in which we had to adjust for measurement error, or in which we had to deal with interaction terms and interpreting interaction terms. So, those discussions where people were reminded of when we learned it and in what context, I think were also kind of helpful. It certainly made everyone feel a whole lot better about it. And, they left saying, oh yeah, I should have done better on this, because now I remember we actually had worked through those things, and it built those connections in ways that I never really saw when I go over the exam, with a whole group discussion.
And this feeds into this larger picture. I think yesterday, Peter Fenlon was talking about it. On one hand, you foster these relationships, and on the other hand, you, in essence, students get to discover that they're not the only ones that have problems, and it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to, in essence, try harder to get the correct answer. So I think it's, it goes even beyond the idea of, okay, I'm leaving the exam room happy and with more knowledge in my backpack.
And once I formed the groups, the same groups were taking all of the exams together, and any group projects in class or group work was done within those same groups too. So they did get to form at least a community within those groups, and a somewhat deeper connections that way. You don't have to do it that way. You could create different groups for each of the exams or for each task, but there is some advantage for doing it, having some persistence there.
I guess you might not have observed this, because usually in the Eco 312 students, they're pretty solid students, and they tend to stick around with the class. But I was wondering if actually, setting up these groups perhaps at the beginning, and they do the corrections for the exam, they eventually do a group project. It's just an offshot here. If that actually increases retention in class, preventing students from dropping out if they actually have some kind of companionship throughout.
It could. I mean, the more connections they form, I think the better it is. I know in my online class, where normally there's quite a lot of attrition in online classes in general, with students disappearing and not completing courses. Since I introduced in my intro class that group podcast project, I have significantly fewer students disappearing than I did before. And I think part of it is because they've actually been working together on a project with 2 or 3 other students, and it gives them more of a sense of community. I think, I think it does build into that whole relationship building and feeling connected to the class community in ways that students in online classes don't always do. Any other thoughts?
John, I had a question.
Sure.
Do you do this on, you said you do this on all your exams. Does that include final exams?
Yes, and the final exam was easier because it was a longer exam. I had roughly the same length of exam, but what I did is I had them take it as a group for about the first 2/3 of the exam period. And I checked back with them. Are you guys almost finished and so forth? And I said, can you all finish by this time? And then they were able to do it. And then at that point, they turn in their exams and then they move into the groups, and I'd pass out a new copy. In that case, I used a shorter version, a somewhat shorter version of the exam, with some things that I was pretty sure they'd all do pretty well on taken out, and just the more complicated questions. And for the last third of the class time, they worked in their groups and then they submitted as a group, which again is a common practice if you have a longer class period. If I had a class period where it was an hour and 20 minutes, I probably would have done it that way for each of the exams, because then you don't have issues of students remembering it and looking things up and coming back that way, although that never seemed to happen. The first time they wouldn't have expected that. I said they'd be getting equivalent questions, but I gave them the same question. After that, it didn't seem to matter. In the second exam, I didn't really notice that sort of thing having occurred based on the discussions I was hearing in the groups. But yeah, in a lot of ways, it's nicer to do it all in one class period. Okay, I guess we probably should end this because I've got to start another session in 3 minutes. So any questions about it, let me know. Oh, there are some resources. I should have shared those. Let me just share a link to them if I can find them. There is a link to a set of resources which mostly contains one second, I will put it in the chat. This has a link to some resources that on giving these 2-stage exams and some of the research findings about them and some best practices and so forth, as well as some mention of exam wrappers. Okay, now I will leave and come back. I'm sorry for those who are coming for the next session. I've got to render the video for this one, and so we'll be right back. I'll be right back in about a minute or so.